Welcome to Books of Kings, the first narrative history podcast on the Bible. We're normally audio only if you're not familiar with us, but we do a video every now and then just to complement what we're covering in the podcasts. And in our last two podcast episodes, we covered the reign of Asa, who was a very long reigning king of Judah. And during Asa's reign, there were battles all around the ancient Near East. We're talking civil wars and battles between nations, empires expanding and seizing new territory. So in order to keep track of all this, I thought I would do a recap with a map to illustrate who the major players were during this period and what the significance of these battles was for the geopolitics of the era. So let's take a look at that and jump in. These are some of the major players during the period. The only important player we cannot see on this map is Assyria off to the east, based in what is now northern Iraq. In this period, the very late 10th century BC and the early 9th century, the period of Asa's reign, is an incredible period to talk about because we have a range of different sources telling us about and corroborating and giving us additional context regarding the biblical narrative. So we've got our usual biblical sources. We have the Deuteronomist and the Chronicler, drawing on records from Israel and from Judah, as well as temple records and now lost prophetic texts from Israel and from Judah. We've also got, for the very first time, a Greek source corroborating the biblical narrative. Menander of Ephesus, we have fragments of his work preserved, and he's telling us what's going on in the ancient Near East from the Phoenician perspective. He's drawing on royal records from Tyre and from Sidon. We have a Moabite inscription known as the Baasha stele. And then off to the east, as I mentioned, Assyria is going to get involved in this region now for the first time. And we have Assyrian inscriptions telling us about their activities, including their march to the Mediterranean Sea. The first major military engagement during this period is between Asa in Judah and a figure down to the south called Zerah the Ethiopian, sometimes translated as Zerah the Cushite. And this guy marches up with an enormous army through Egypt, maybe at the instigation of Egypt. We really don't know much about this Zerah guy or where he came from or who exactly is paying him, if anyone. But he attempts to invade Judah, and Asa, despite having a much smaller army, arrays his forces and prepares to fight Zerah. Now Asa then prays a bold prayer, but a simple and an elegant one. And it's a prayer that could be easily used in a range of situations. So I'm going to go ahead and read you that prayer. This is from the Chronicler. Asa prayed, "O Lord, there is none like you to help between the mighty and the weak. Help us, O Lord our God, for we rely on you. And in your name we have come against this multitude. O Lord, you are our God. Let not man prevail against you." And this prayer is answered by God. Asa defeats and routs Zerah, and not only pushes this enormous army out of Judah, but then takes some new cities, sacks them and loots them, and brings these resources back to Judah to enrich it. So this ends up being a net gain for Asa. Now this prayer, I think it's important to point out here, is a prayer for personal victory. It's kind of like if someone was threatening your family, you had to use violence to defend your family from this person, and just before going into battle, you prayed, "O Lord, in your name I come against this attacker. Lord, by giving me victory, let not man prevail against you." Now, if you did this, Christians today, I think, even though they'd want you to successfully defend your family, would maybe see that prayer as a little bit blasphemous. Christians might say, well, of course you are praying for God to protect you. You're praying that your self-interest will be satisfied. Who are you to say, "I come against this person in God's name," or "let not man prevail against you"? Who are you to equate yourself with God? But the new covenant is an extension, a broadening of the old covenant. And one thing that we retain from the old covenant is the ability to invoke God's aid. God's people can invoke God's aid, can call God to rescue them and come to their assistance. Jesus says that we can call on God to have mountains thrown into the sea. Peter is able, in God's power, to walk on water. So this is, I think, an exemplary prayer. It's a prayer that is bold and sincere and yearning, and it's a prayer that was acceptable to God, and God answers. So much for Zerah. We're not going to hear anything more from him. Let's turn now to Baasha in the north, the real enemy of Asa and of Judah. Baasha was an Israelite general who took power from the family of Jeroboam, which he then exterminated in accordance with Ahiah's prophetic condemnation of Jeroboam's family. At this time, I know this map shows Samaria as the capital of Israel. That has not happened yet. Tisra is the capital of Israel. Israel had, when Baasha took power, been fighting this seemingly endless and really irritating war with the Philistines. But Baasha is clever, and he looks at Asa's victory over Zerah, and he looks at the fact that Asa's older brother and predecessor Abiam had defeated an enormous Israelite army. And he says to himself, the real threat is not the Philistines. The real threat is Judah. So I would be wise to focus my attention on Judah. Now, Baasha knows he cannot beat Judah in a head-on collision. This did not work for Jeroboam, and it didn't work for Zerah. Judah is just unbeatable during this period. So he decides, one, to secure his northern or his rear border, and to do that, he forges an alliance with the Aramaeans, or the Syrians to the north. Now again, rather than confront Judah directly in a traditional battle, he decides to put pressure on Judah by fortifying Ramah, just to the north of Judah. Through setting up this blockade, Israel hopes essentially to choke out Judah slowly and steadily. Now Baasha is clever, and as clever as Baasha is, Asa is clever. And Asa sends envoys around up to the Aramaeans, and he says, Aram, what are you really getting out of this? You would in fact benefit much more from siding with me, because if you join with me, we will have Israel flanked. You can invade from the north, I will attack Israel from the south. Each of us will make off with a great deal of wealth. You can't get me from up there, but you can get Israel, and we can attack Israel from both sides in this pincer formation. And Aram buys this. It breaks off its alliance with Israel. It attacks from the north. In fact, it invades with a significant army. And then, sure enough, Asa does attack from the south, dismantles the fortification at Ramah while Israel is distracted, and brings the resources from that fortification back down into Judah. So we've seen this consistent pattern of Asa defeating enemies to the north and south, taking resources from those conquests, bringing them back to Judah, and all around securing the borders of Judah. Now that Asa has triumphed over all of his enemies, as the region continues to descend into turmoil and civil conflict and war, Asa is going to be uninvolved for the rest of this period. He's instead going to focus internally on his religious reforms, on promoting monotheism in Judah. So he adopts a policy of non-intervention with respect to the surrounding nations, and this turns out to be for the best. As we're going to see, Israel's much more diplomatic and engaged foreign policy is ultimately going to work to their disadvantage because it's going to position them in diplomatic proximity to a power that's eventually going to exert control over them and ultimately destroy them, the Assyrians. Now, Baasha, due to his ungodliness, incurs the same prophetic condemnation that Jeroboam incurred. A prophet comes to Baasha and says, your entire house is going to be destroyed. And sure enough, that's what happens upon Baasha's death. And not only is Baasha's household destroyed, but Israel itself is ripped into pieces in a terrible period of civil war. Immediately after Baasha's death, his incompetent, drunkard son is hunkered down in Tisra, but is attacked by Zimri, an Israelite general, not unlike Baasha once was, who then takes control of Tisra. Now Zimri appears to have been unpopular. He doesn't reign for very long, And immediately after his seizure of power, another Israelite general, Omri, breaks off a siege of the Philistines, returns to Tisra, and surrounds it. Zimri is entirely out of options, and he takes the only way out he can think of. He sets the palace at Tisra on fire and burns himself in it. Now, Omri does not then cleanly seize power. Israel is ripped into two. Half of Israel refuses to accept Omri's rule and rallies behind another contender for the throne. Omri then has to defeat this rival, and finally, when he defeats them, he's able to unify Israel. Once Omri takes control of Israel, he embarks upon a series of vigorous, energetic projects. One thing that he does is he invades Moab to the south of Israel. Moab is a separate ethnic and cultural region distinct from Israel and Judah, but it had formerly been a conquered territory under the United Kingdom of Israel and Judah. Now Omri retakes Moab and occupies it, and we learn from a Moabite inscription about their ongoing struggle to maintain an independence from Israel, that they dated back to this period, to Omri's reconquest of Moab. Now, perhaps with the resources that Omri took from Moab, he then establishes a new capital. Caleb and I in our podcast compared this kind of to David's establishing Jerusalem as the capital of the United Kingdom, or Constantine establishing Constantinople as the new capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, and he builds the city of Samaria, and hence the term Samaritans will refer to the later people that come to dwell in this region. Now, Omri, as I mentioned a moment ago, is very diplomatically engaged, and one thing that he does is he forges an alliance with Phoenicia, it seems, and ultimately, regardless of who actually initiated this, Omri's son, Prince Ahab, is married to the princess of Phoenicia, Jezebel. Now, it really has not been that long since Solomon. Remember that Asa is only Solomon's grandson. And if you're confused about that, some people think that Asa is Solomon's great-grandson. Go listen to our podcast episodes on Asa. I think that's 8 and 9. But how did we get from Hiram, king of Tyre, Solomon's ally, who actually not only helped build the temple at Jerusalem, but helped design it? The temple at Jerusalem is built in a Phoenician design. How did we get from Hiram, king of Tyre, to Jezebel, coming from Phoenicia and marrying Ahab? The answer lies in the generations following Hiram. Hiram's family ruled in Tyre for a while, until Hiram's grandson was murdered and usurped by the family of his nurse. These courtiers then ruled and squabbled and set off a period of dynastic turmoil that ended ultimately when a priest king named Ithobaal usurped and killed the then occupant of the throne and took power. Ithobaal I was a priest of Ishtar, and so he was apparently quite vigorous in his devotion to Phoenician religion. This was the father of Jezebel, and this fact that Ithobaal was a priest of Ishtar may help explain why Jezebel was so zealous in imposing worship of the Phoenician gods in Israel. Now, at some point during this period, Tyre expanded and took control of Sidon, so we call this whole area the United Kingdom of Tyre and Sidon, or Phoenicia. And also, at some point after this period, a group of Phoenician colonists embarked on a journey to North Africa, where they founded a city known as Carthage. Now, how do we know all this? We know this from Menander of Ephesus, the Greek historian I mentioned earlier, and Menander has repeatedly proven to be an incredibly reliable source. A number of the things that he says check out against external inscriptions, and his reporting of Phoenician records dates all the way back to the time of Solomon, and he mentions from the Phoenician perspective the interaction between Hiram and Solomon, who then ruled over the United Kingdom of Israel and Judah. Now, during this period, and after Ithobaal's seizure of power in Phoenicia, a new enemy showed up on the scene. an enemy unlike anything we had seen in the region before. This is the Assyrians, marching now under Ashurnasirpal II, the founder of the entity that we call the Assyrian Empire. Ashurnasirpal marched in from the east. He marched through and battled the Aramaeans, defeated them, and went all the way to Phoenicia, where Ithobaal surrendered to Ashurnasirpal, giving him gifts and making himself into an Assyrian vassal king. Now, although he fought in Aram, Ashurnasirpal II actually did not normally fight pitched battles. Instead, as he marched from northern Iraq to the Mediterranean, he typically intimidated cities into submission using public displays of torture and mutilation and various kinds of creative arrangements of human skin and limbs. And Phoenicia submitted to him in order to avoid this fate, we can assume, and they gave him a number of items signaling their submission, including walrus tusks, so that Ashurnasirpal could display these in Assur proper and demonstrate that his empire extended to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, having founded this enormous empire, and here we're looking at a modern map, Phoenicia roughly corresponds to modern-day Lebanon, Ashurnasirpal founded a new capital in northern Iraq. This is something that David did, that Omri did, that Constantine much later did. This is a normal pattern for energetic, ambitious rulers who want to found not only a new dynasty, but a whole new political regime. And to inaugurate the establishment of this grand empire, sometimes called the First Empire in the ancient world, Ashurnasirpal builds a spectacular capital at what's now called Nimrud. This was an ancient city known as Kalhu, but Ashurnasirpal builds a spectacular palace there. He holds a feast at which there are thousands upon thousands of barrels of beer, skins of wine, lambs killed. 5,000 dignitaries from all over the world gather for this feast, and Nimrud becomes the most architecturally spectacular and the most populated city in likely the world at the time. There were, by the way, very large ruins in Nimrud from Ashurnasirpal's construction projects until just a few years ago, when Nimrud was destroyed by ISIS. The Islamic State actually brought in bulldozers and systematically razed the whole city to the ground. So Nimrud reportedly is no more, although there are also conflicting reports that some of the ruins are left in place. Now, we don't often think of Assyria as being involved with Israel or Judah during the reign of Ahab. We think of that as more of a Hezekiah thing. But it's important to point out that already Ahab's queen is the daughter of Ithobaal, who is an Assyrian vassal king. So the key takeaway here is that Israel is already plugged into an empire that in the end is going to become their ruin. We'll continue with the story of Israel and Judah on our next regular podcast episode, next time on Books of Kings.